Thank you very much, John. Good evening, everyone. I don't think I've ever, in an introduction, been compared to Thomas More. I would say that the odds on my ending up like Thomas More have gotten somewhat better since November 9th at about 2 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So I'm happy to be here and to be with my old friend Bishop Conley and Father Mattia and all of you. It is no sacrifice for me, Father, to come to the real America from the asylum in which I live and work and have my being inside the Beltway. So thank you for having me. Over the past year, some disturbing data on young people has come to light. Shortly before the election, a reputable poll indicated that 35% of millennials, that is those born since 1980, 35% believe that George W. Bush killed more people than Stalin. Similarly, troubling data emerges from the World Values Survey. In that same age cohort of millennials, only 1/3, for example, of Dutch young people thought it essential to live in a democratically governed state, while only 30% of U.S. millennials did, and 24% of U.S. millennials thought democracy a bad or very bad way to run a country. Moreover, only 32% of those same U.S. millennials thought it essential in a democracy that civil rights protect people's liberty, while only 19% believed it illegitimate for the military to take over when the government is incompetent or failing to do its job. Moreover, millennials' participation in the most elementary of democratic exercises, voting, is the lowest in the population. For while millennials are now some 35% of the population of the United States, they typically make up only 19% of the actual electorate. Now, you may wish to say, given the data I just cited, well, that's a relief. Who wants those people voting anyway? But those ill-educated and ill-informed millennials, of whom I'm sure there are none present here tonight, will be in leadership roles of one sort or another in this country in the not-too-distant future. So it's very much worth asking, what is to be done to fix what seems to be a profound problem of ignorance in our society? For there is no way to parse the numbers I've just cited here without recognizing that they reflect a colossal and dangerous failure in education, a failure that stunts young lives and that imperils the American democratic project. And my suggestion tonight, not surprisingly from the title of the talk, is that the antidote to that failure, particularly at the undergraduate level of university life, is the revival of classic liberal arts education. And what do I mean by that? I mean a thorough grounding in the great works of literature, of philosophy, and theology, complemented by a close study of history, so that on achieving a first degree, a baccalaureate degree, a bachelor's degree, a graduate understands that he or she is the heir of a civilization which has, for all its faults, been the most creative and dynamic and the most conducive to genuine human flourishing ever. The liberal arts, properly engaged, are an antidote to the great solvents that are eating away at Western civilization today. Solvents that make the democratic project all the more difficult to operate well, so that justice is more than the name on a building in Washington, and the common good is understood as the responsibility of all. What are those solvents eating away at the foundations of the West today? In no particular order of toxicity, I would say they are Gnosticism, skepticism, moral relativism, radical individualism, and willfulness. Gnosticism. Those of you who have studied early Christian history know that the Gnostic heresy was one of the first out of the box in the history of Christianity. It's been remarkably protean over 2,000 years, and it now appears in the guise of the notion that everything in the human condition is plastic and malleable. There are no givens in our lives, even biologically. This Gnosticism today masks itself as a kind of hyper-materialism, but in fact it's a deeply deprecatory view of the created world. It teaches us that stuff doesn't count. Only gnosis, only esoteric knowledge, only the will is the form that comes in today, counts. This 21st century form of Gnosticism is now fed by the second toxin, skepticism. The claim, which I am afraid is widespread throughout American higher education, most particularly and most dramatically in philosophy departments, that human beings just can't get at the truth of things. It's not there for us to grasp. Knowledge is fragmentary and incoherent. You can't put the whole picture together. You might get a glimpse here and a glimpse there. But we really are at a great distance from the truth. This, of course, feeds the third toxin, moral relativism, which today primarily appears in the form of the postmodern claim that while there may be your truth and my truth, there's really nothing properly describable as the truth. There's just your truth, and there's what's true for you, and there's what's true for me. And this, in turn, feeds the fourth toxin of radical individualism. It was expressed most powerfully in the 2015 Supreme Court decision, Obergefell versus Hodges, in which, writing for the majority of the court, Justice Anthony Kennedy, in the process of declaring a regime of anyone can marry anyone throughout the United States, described the human person as essentially a twitching bundle of desires, which the state exists to help facilitate the satisfaction of. And the satisfaction of those desires, whatever they may be, because after all, there's only your truth and my truth, is the full meaning of human rights. If that's your concept of the human person, if that's, to use the term in its philosophical sense, your anthropology, then you will be led by a very short path to the notion that the highest exercise of human freedom is that defined by the great moral philosopher Frank Sinatra when he sang, "I did it my way." Okay, it's my way that constitutes the highest exercise of human freedom. And this, of course, then leads us to the fifth toxin, the fifth solvent eating away at our civilization. And that is the notion first articulated in its most powerful form in the 19th century by Friedrich Nietzsche, that the will to power is at the center of the human condition. For what happens when your truth and my truth collide, and neither one of us recognizes something called the truth by which we can settle the argument between your truth and my truth? Well, Nietzsche saw this in the late 19th century. You will impose your power on me, or I will impose my power on you. So a regime of coercion rather than deliberation and consent to governance inevitably follows. We can come at this from another angle. Think of the civilization of the West as a three-legged stool. And the three legs are labeled Jerusalem, Athens, Rome. And it's the interaction of Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome over some several thousand years that has produced this distinctive enterprise we call Western civilization. What's the Jerusalem stool? It's the notion that life is journey, life is pilgrimage, life is adventure, life is heading somewhere. The human story is heading somewhere, which is to say that life is not cyclical or random or just one darn thing after another. And the great metaphor for this, the metaphor which in some sense is the foundational image, the foundational story, or to use the horrible word of the moment, narrative, of the Western civilizational enterprise is the Exodus. It's liberation from an enslaved past heading toward a future of freedom. That's the Jerusalem leg of the stool. The Athenian leg, formed in the 6th, 5th, 4th centuries BC in Athens, was the conviction that there are truths built into the world and into us, and that human reason can get at those. Human reason can grasp those truths, can understand them in an orderly way. That was the great contribution of the ancient philosophers of Greece to this civilizational enterprise called the West. which included, among other things, the notion that what is also what is and what is not are two different things. We call it the principle of non-contradiction. Something cannot be and not be at the same time, which is very much the conviction of a parallel civilization at about the same time of Socrates and Aristotle and Plato, the civilization of India, where something could indeed be and not be at the same time. It's very important, for example, that when that Jerusalem leg of the stool, produced in the form of the Christian movement, this new religious community formed out of the conviction that Jesus is Lord, that community, on encountering a broader world in what we call Christian mission, found itself first in a cultural context which had the principle of non-contradiction. Because that Athenian confidence in reason allowed the Christian community to turn confession of faith, Jesus is Lord, Jesus is risen, into creed and doctrine. I've often explained this to people by saying, suppose today's the feast of St. Andrew, my secondary patron, my confirmation name. Thank you very much for your good wishes. You may not call me Andy. I said, suppose the apostles had turned right rather than turned left in coming out of the ancient Holy Land, so that the first enculturation of the gospel took place in India rather than in the Greco-Roman world, which means it took place in a culture that did not have the principle of non-contradiction. So you could say Jesus is Lord and Jesus is not Lord, and they both make sense. There's no way you get to the Nicene Creed that way. So it made a big difference that they turned left instead of turning right. And by turning left, they also came to Rome, which brings us to the third leg on the stool. And what is the Roman contribution to this singular civilizational enterprise we call the West? It's the notion that we find most powerfully in the writings of Cicero, that the rule of law is superior to brute force in governing a polity, in governing a political community. We know how imperfect that was in Rome, but the conviction was there. And so you have these three legs of the stool, or these three cultural dynamics, Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome, working together over a period of centuries to produce, by certainly the early 11th century, what is recognizable as the civilization of the Western world, with its distinctive emphasis on the dignity of the human person, its understanding of the common good, its distinction between spiritual and political authority, and all of the other things that go to make up the civilization of the West. And then over the next 1,000 years, that civilizational enterprise develops so that towards the last third of that second millennium, you get what we call the democratic project, again as an expression of Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome. Problem is that beginning in the 19th century, Western high culture systematically dismantled the stool, the three legs of the stool, with effects being felt today. The first leg to get kicked out from the stool was the Jerusalem leg. And that was kicked out by the project, the intellectual project, described by the great French thinker of the 20th century, Henri de Lubac, as the project of atheistic humanism. Namely, a humanism which began from the premise that the God of the Bible is the enemy of human maturation and freedom. Which, as de Lubac pointed out, was a great inversion, because the God of the Bible, in fact, came into this flowing river of history precisely as a liberator. I mean, think of, for example, the gods of the ancient world into which the people of Israel, having left Egyptian bondage, found themselves at the end of that Exodus experience. These were the fearsome gods of the Phoenicians or the Philistines, who, among other things, demanded and got child sacrifice. I mean, that's what gods were like. Or think of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Even the strongest of men, Achilles, Odysseus, are finally but playthings of the gods who are moving the pieces on a kind of cosmic chessboard. And those strong individuals, much less the weak, are not finally in control of their own destiny. So the claim, beginning with figures like Auguste Comte, Ludwig Feuerbach, Karl Marx, ultimately Nietzsche, that this God of the Bible is the enemy of human liberation and maturation, was a tremendous inversion of the story. It turned the story inside out, and yet it had, as we know, a tremendous impact on the high culture of the West, in which by the mid-20th century, it was really not acceptable to be deeply religious, much less pious. I mean, try to think of a major intellectual figure in the mid-20th century, at least as the world recognizes major intellectual figures, who was a person of deep religious conviction. It's very hard to come up with some. You can come up with a few, but the general attitude was that attitude of what de Lubac called atheistic humanism, that a genuine humanism is going to get rid of this God business in order for a maturing humanity to emerge. Well, if you kick out one leg of the stool, you've got a stool with two legs. And a stool with two legs is going to get wobbly, right? So the next thing to collapse was the Athenian leg. Because it turns out that if you don't have the idea, if you are not convinced that there is a rationality built into the world, we would say in Christian theological terms that the logos, the Word of God imprinted in the world a rationality that we can grasp through our reason. If you don't believe that, if all of this is just a cosmic accident, that somehow the universe got the biochemistry right to produce this thing called humanity on this little blue marble in the sky called the Earth, if there is no imprint, if you will, of the divine logic in the world, then reason left to its own devices turns on itself and begins to doubt its own capacities. And thus you get what is, I'm afraid, the dominant view in most philosophy departments in the Western world today, and that is the now dominant postmodern view that there's your truth and my truth, but to assert that there are truths built into us and into the world, that we can know by reason is simply off the board of serious discussion. Well, if you've got a three-legged stool and now two legs have been kicked out, you've got a one-legged stool. And what happens when you sit on a one-legged stool? Crunch. And that, I suggest, is what really has happened over the past, one could trace this any number of ways, but let's say 150 years or so. Is that, and we're now seeing the effects with the collapse of the third leg of the stool, because, as I said a moment ago, if there's only your truth and my truth, and our two truths collide, and there's no horizon of judgment against which we can settle the argument. There's nothing we recognize as the truth that'll tell us which one of those truths is really true. Then you are going to impose your power on me, or I am going to impose my power on you. And thus we have coercion, sometimes of a cultural form, sometimes of a legal form, emerging more and more in the Western world. I mean, the examples of this could be multiplied endlessly. I would suggest that the Obama administration's contraceptive abortifacient mandate, bullying, the Little Sisters of the Poor was one example of this kind of coercion based precisely on a notion that there's the government's truth and there's the sister's truth, and somebody's going to win that argument by sheer coercive power. I have to say that students attempting to shut down free speech in the name of inclusion and, ironically, diversity on university campuses across the country is another form of coercion that is an expression of this collapse of Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome. So we have this unhappy picture of a government that is supposed to be an expression of the will of the people turned into a bully, and universities which exist putatively for the search for knowledge and wisdom and truth turned into rather expensive daycare centers. Now, liberal arts education, classically understood, is the antidote to this self-deconstruction, because let's understand what's going on here. If this picture is reasonably accurate, and we are in a moment of some cultural and civilizational crisis, no one has done this to us, okay? The Nazis lost, the fascists lost, the communists lost. This is auto-constructed self-deconstruction. And that's why the answer to it must come from within that civilizational enterprise itself. Imagine that rather than the smorgasbord with which most students are presented in most universities today, imagine that we had, over the past 50 years or 60 years, generations raised up who knew what someone like John Quincy Adams knew, who had read the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Aeneid, probably in the original languages, who were deeply immersed in Hamlet and King Lear and The Merchant of Venice, who at least knew what Dostoevsky was about in Crime and Punishment. Those were the kind of men who could produce the Federalist Papers. Suppose we add to that list of what classically educated founders of this country and framers of the Constitution simply took it for granted that an educated person knew some other things. Suppose we add to that a deep knowledge of the Bible, of Exodus, of Isaiah, of the Gospels, of the book of Job. Suppose we added to that a familiarity with Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. And then suppose we added to that mix things of a more contemporary vintage. Suppose that no one left a undergraduate education without having encountered Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited, Elie Wiesel's little novelette Night, Martin Luther King's Letter from Birmingham Jail, Alexander Solzhenitsyn's One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. What would have been the situation over the past 60 years if that body of thought, if those great books, to use the old-fashioned term, had been worked into the texture of the minds and characters of American adults today? I don't think we would have had the kind of election cycle we've just gone through. I don't think we would have seen the world's oldest democracy descend into a kind of national food fight for 15, 16 months. And why is that the case? And why would recovering a commitment to that kind of learning, which actually can begin in high school and maybe even earlier, doesn't have to begin in university. Why would that be the case? Why would things be different? I think it's because the classic liberal arts teach 10 lessons, life lessons, if you will, that are essential to making a democracy work. Lesson number 1, the dignity of the human person as inalienable, or if you prefer, built in, not something bestowed by the state, and not something that is a function of race, ethnicity, or gender. Second lesson to be learned from a classic liberal education, the superiority of reason to raw emotionalism in human flourishing. And the notion that a life dominated by emoting rather than thinking is not a fully human life. This is not to say that there's no role for the heart in life, but it is to say that when emotivism, emoting, trumps thinking at all points along the line, there's something not fully adult, there's something not fully human going on here. Third lesson, the great works of our civilization teach us, is a sense of responsibility for the common good. That the good life is not simply a life of personal pleasure or private aggrandizement, but the good life includes a willingness to contribute to, and if necessary, to sacrifice for, the common good. It's a life that recognizes the truth embedded around the pool, the reflecting pool at the Korean Veterans War Memorial in Washington, D.C. Freedom is never free. The fourth lesson that the great books of the classic liberal arts tradition teach us is the willingness to engage others with civility and respect, knowing that to oppose does not mean to hate or to scorn or to belittle. Word tolerance is used a great deal in our society today, but usually without any real understanding of its meaning. Tolerance, as many of you know, comes from the Latin deponent verb tolerare, which means to bear with. To bear with. Tolerance is not avoiding difference, as if difference made no difference. Tolerance is engaging difference within a bond of that civility and respect that ought to characterize a democratic citizenry. The fifth lesson those great books teach us, and here we would go right back to the beginnings, at least on the Greek side of things, with the Iliad and the Odyssey, the lesson of the critical importance of integrity, prudence, and moderation in public life. Something that seems to have been lost sight of rather dramatically today, when what was assumed, certainly within my memory, and I suspect most of yours here, to be a fundamental democratic truth, character counts in public life, has simply fallen by the wayside. Simply fallen by the wayside. The sixth lesson the great tradition teaches us is the ability to distinguish between what is truly wisdom and what is merely whiz-bang. For example, the whiz-bang that comes in 140 characters or less. To immerse yourself in these great works is to learn that you can't really get very deeply into things in 140 characters or a Facebook post, or even, I will admit, an op-ed column. It takes a bit more time, takes a bit more work. The seventh thing we learn from the great tradition and from the liberal arts is a recognition that democracy depends on a critical mass of virtue in the citizenry, not just on a well-functioning machinery of government. You know, one of the great cautionary tales of the 20th century is the story of the Weimar Republic in Germany. The attempt at a German democracy between the end of the First World War and 1933. The Weimar Republic had a beautifully designed democratic architecture. One of its designers was one of the great social scientists of the 20th century, Max Weber. Had all the right stuff, separation of powers, balance, all this kind of stuff. Independent judiciary, Bill of Rights, etc. It looked great on paper. And it lasted 12 years, and at the end, it produced its antithesis. Because it should never be forgotten that Hitler and the National Socialists came to power through an election. They then got rid of elections, but they came to power through that well-designed system. So this teaches us that the machinery is insufficient. It takes a certain kind of people possessing certain virtues to make that machinery work. I would add this is as true for markets as it is for government. You can't make a free economy work without a critical mass of virtue in that world as well. This used to be known. Early in the election cycle this year, I read a wonderful new biography of John Quincy Adams, the last of the great Puritan statesmen. A remarkable figure. Very few people know much about him today. He probably held more high offices than anyone in the history of the country. President, Secretary of State, Senator, member of the House of Representatives, ambassador to 3 or 4 different countries. Spoke a half a dozen languages, was a reasonably competent poet, a great diarist, negotiated treaties for the revolutionary government when he was 20 years old. Cranky character. The author of this biography got my attention very early, to be precise, in the 7th sentence in the book, on page 1, when he wrote, "John Quincy Adams did not aim to please, and he usually succeeded." But as you read through this really quite extraordinary life, which of course ends with the great Amistad case before the Supreme Court and whatnot, which you know from the movie, what is so striking about it is first and foremost his determination to be a man of virtue, which he got from both that Puritan tradition and the classical tradition, and his deep concern that this new democracy, and it was new to him. I mean, he's 7 years old when the Battle of Bunker Hill is taking place, and Abigail has taken him out to watch the fireworks on the other side of the bay. That this new democracy would not work without a virtuous citizenry. And that idea, I think, was quite widespread in those first 2 generations. We need to be reminded of it today. The 8th lesson that the liberal arts teach us is an instinct for sniffing out demagoguery, because you can't read the historical books of the Bible, or the Iliad, or the Odyssey, or the Aeneid, or the great plays of classical Greece, or Shakespeare, without getting an instinct for sniffing out the demagogue who, precisely by appealing to emotion rather than reason, makes himself the man of power. That's very important in a democratic society. 9th, the liberal arts teach us an appreciation for the truly beautiful, not just the transiently alluring or amusing. There's a sense in which today we as a culture are amusing ourselves to death. A country addicted to reality TV should not be surprised when its elections turn into a kind of reality TV show. The antidote to that is an instinct for, indeed a thirst for, what is truly beautiful, not just transiently amusing or alluring. And finally, the liberal arts teach us a sense of life as adventure. They help us recover the human truth that Jews and Christians would say was divinely embedded in that image and narrative of the Exodus. That life is not just a pain in the neck, that it's not just a matter of getting through, that it's not cyclical, that it has a goal, that it has a direction, and therefore it's an adventure, because getting on the right track and following that through is never easy. That sense of life as adventure cuts against, I think, the often prevalent sense today that life can be essentially a burden, which burden we try to lift through this attachment to the transiently alluring or amusing. As Dr. Free mentioned, I spent 15 years, or at least a considerable part of 15 years, writing 2 rather large volumes of biography of John Paul II. In his 1991 encyclical Centesimus Annus, which I think is one of the great masterpieces of political theory in the 20th century. It's not emphatically not for Catholics only. John Paul II, I think, presciently saw into the future of the free and virtuous society in the 21st century and said that that free and virtuous society would be composed of three interlocking parts. Those of you who are old enough to remember Ballantine beer can think of the old Ballantine beer logo. I'm sure Bishop Conley drank his share of Ballantine beer at KU back in the day. That was good undergraduate cheap beer, right? Three interlocking parts. A democratic political community, a free economy, and a vibrant public moral culture. And I think it was the genius of Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II, to see that it was the third that was the key to all the rest. The vibrancy and vitality of the public moral culture was the key to making freedom in politics and freedom in economics yield genuine human flourishing rather than human degradation. To repeat, it takes a certain kind of people possessed of certain virtues to make the machinery of free politics and free economics work. And if we sense today that that machinery is breaking down, isn't working as well as it should, we may wish to look at that analysis of John Paul II and see that the root of that, or one root of that, one significant root of that, is a wounded culture. And then the question becomes, what heals the wounded culture? Well, there are many things that do. But surely an encounter with the great human minds and spirits of the past can lead to a renewal of vigor in democratic life. As Matthew Arnold famously said in the 19th century, we should share with future generations the best that has been thought and said, and share that as broadly as possible. And that's what classic liberal education does. It practices what I have come to call over the years the ecumenism of time. It extends the ecumenical enterprise not simply widely among Catholics, Protestants, Orthodox today, it extends it in time. It brings into the conversation the great minds and spirits of the past. And I would suggest that a genuinely democratic spirit, a genuine encounter with those great minds and spirits in that ecumenism of time tutors us in excellence, as it teaches us that a true democratic spirit is one that honors the wisdom of the past, even as it seeks to extend it into the future. Thank you.